The discovery. The agricultural station on Kepler 442b had been silent for exactly 93 days when Captain James Rivera received the distress beacon. He sat in the command chair of the cargo freighter Steadfast, reviewing supply manifests for the Mars colonies, when the emergency signal cut through every other communication channel like a knife through silk. The message was short and desperate, just 8 words that made his blood run cold: "They're in the soil, please send help." James had been hauling supplies through the outer colonies for 12 years, and he had seen his share of disasters. Equipment failures, meteor strikes, even a few outbreaks of space fever that turned entire crews into paranoid wrecks. But this was different. The Kepler station was humanity's crown jewel, a research facility where scientists had successfully grown Earth crops in alien soil for the first time in human history. 200 colonists lived there, families included, and they had been celebrating record harvests just 3 months ago. Now there was only silence and that single, cryptic message. James called his crew to the bridge. First Officer Sarah Chen arrived first, still wiping sleep from her eyes. She had been napping in her quarters after pulling a double shift to repair a malfunctioning cargo bay door. Engineering Chief Marcus Webb came next, his massive frame filling the doorway as he ducked through. The man had played professional football before joining the colonial fleet, and he still moved with the careful grace of someone who knew his own strength. Medical Officer Dr. Yuki Tanaka was last to arrive, carrying her ever-present medical scanner even though they were still 3 days away from Kepler Station. James played the distress message for them 3 times. Each repetition made the words sound more ominous. Sarah leaned forward and asked the obvious question: what could possibly be in the soil that would warrant a distress call? The planet had been surveyed for 5 years before colonization began. Every sample had been tested and retested. The soil contained no pathogens, no toxins, nothing that could harm human life. Marcus suggested equipment failure or perhaps a psychological breakdown among the isolated colonists. Living on the edge of explored space did strange things to people's minds. Maybe someone had snapped and the message was a cry for help from frightened survivors. Yuki shook her head and pointed out that the voice on the recording belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Park, the station's chief botanist. She was one of the most stable and brilliant scientists in the colonial service. If she said something was in the soil, then something was in the soil. James made the decision to divert course immediately. The Steadfast was only carrying non-perishable supplies that could afford a delay, and the Kepler station was too important to ignore. If humanity was going to spread across the galaxy, they needed to master agriculture on alien worlds. Whatever had gone wrong at Kepler needed to be fixed quickly before panic spread through the other colonies. The 3-day journey felt like 3 years. James tried to contact the station 17 times using every communication frequency he could access. There was no response, not even static. The station's automated systems continued broadcasting routine telemetry showing normal power levels, stable atmosphere, and optimal growing conditions in the agricultural domes. Everything looked perfect according to the instruments, but nobody was answering the phone. Sarah spent most of the trip in the navigation station, plotting emergency escape routes in case they encountered hostility at Kepler. Marcus checked and rechecked the Steadfast's limited weapons systems, which consisted of a few mining lasers and a single rail gun meant for clearing debris from flight paths. Yuki prepared the medical bay for mass casualties and reviewed every known alien pathogen in the colonial database, looking for anything that might explain the distress call. James watched Kepler 442b grow larger in the viewscreen as they approached. The planet was beautiful in a harsh sort of way, with purple-tinged vegetation covering the lowlands and massive mountain ranges jutting up through bands of orange clouds. The Kepler station sat in a broad valley near the equator, a cluster of white domes connected by enclosed walkways that looked like a child's toy scattered across the alien landscape. As they entered orbit, Sarah picked up something unusual on the long-range scanners. The agricultural domes were glowing with a faint bioluminescence that had not been present in any previous survey data. The glow pulsed in slow rhythmic patterns that almost looked intentional, like something breathing or perhaps thinking. James ordered a full sensor sweep of the station and the surrounding area. The results made no sense. Life signs showed 200 humans, exactly the number that should be present at the station. All of them were clustered in the main residential dome, which suggested they had abandoned the agricultural areas and other facilities. But the strange part was the other readings. The sensors detected massive biological activity in the farming domes, far more than could be explained by the crops that were supposed to be growing there. Whatever was producing the bioluminescence was alive and it was spreading. Marcus suggested they contact the colonial authority and wait for a proper military response team. They were just a cargo ship with a crew of 4, hardly equipped to handle a potential biological crisis. But James remembered those 8 words from Dr. Park's message. She had said, "Please," in a tone that carried true desperation. People were in danger down there, and the Steadfast was the only ship in range. James gave the order to land. Sarah plotted an approach vector that would bring them down near the residential dome, away from the glowing agricultural areas. Marcus armed the rail gun and set the mining lasers to maximum power. Yuki prepared isolation suits for everyone and loaded her medical kit with broad-spectrum antibiotics and sedatives. The Steadfast descended through the orange clouds, and James got his first close look at what had happened to humanity's greatest agricultural achievement. The farming domes were no longer white but had turned a deep emerald green, covered entirely by some kind of plant growth that pulsed with that eerie bioluminescence. The growth had spread beyond the domes, reaching out across the valley floor like fingers stretching toward the residential areas. Where the alien plants touched the native purple vegetation, the local flora withered and died, replaced by more of the glowing green growth. Sarah brought them down on a landing pad that had been partially overtaken by thin tendrils of the mysterious plant life. The tendrils retreated from the heat of their landing thrusters, curling back like living things avoiding pain. James watched through the view screen and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This was not a simple agricultural accident. This was something intelligent, something that had been waiting in the soil of Kepler 442b for its chance to emerge. The crew suited up in full isolation gear, checking and double-checking their seals. Marcus grabbed a plasma cutter from the engineering stores, and Sarah armed herself with a flare gun that could double as a weapon if needed. Yuki carried her medical scanner and a case full of sample containers. James took the lead, armed with nothing but a standard-issue stun baton and a deep sense of responsibility for whatever they were about to find. They opened the airlock and stepped out onto the surface of Kepler 442b. The air was breathable according to their instruments, but nobody was willing to trust it after seeing what had happened to the station. The glowing plants pulsed brighter as they approached, and James could swear he felt something watching them, waiting to see what these new visitors would do. Into the green. The walk from the landing pad to the residential dome took only 5 minutes, but it felt like crossing an alien battlefield. The mysterious plant growth had spread across every surface, climbing walls and wrapping around equipment with the deliberate patience of a predator lying in wait. James led his crew in single file, stepping carefully over the thickest concentrations of the glowing vegetation. Every time his boot came close to the plants, they seemed to lean toward him, thin tendrils reaching up like fingers trying to touch his isolation suit. Marcus kept his plasma cutter ready, the blue pilot light casting strange shadows across his faceplate. He muttered constantly about how much he hated plants, which would have been funny under different circumstances. Sarah walked directly behind James, her flare gun sweeping left and right as she checked every shadow for movement. Yuki brought up the rear, her medical scanner chirping softly as it recorded readings that grew more disturbing with each passing second. The residential dome's main entrance had been sealed from the inside using emergency protocols. Heavy blast doors covered the airlock, and someone had welded additional metal plates across any possible gaps. James studied the crude reinforcements and understood the message they conveyed. The colonists were not trying to keep atmospheric pressure stable, they were trying to keep something out. Sarah found the communication panel next to the entrance and activated it. Her voice echoed through the external speakers as she identified the Steadfast and requested entry. For a long moment, there was no response. Then a woman's voice crackled through the speaker, rough with exhaustion and barely controlled panic. Dr. Elizabeth Park asked them to confirm their identity using security codes that only authorized colonial vessels would know. James rattled off the codes from memory, and the blast doors began to grind open. The airlock cycled them through 3 separate decontamination chambers. Each one blasted them with ultraviolet light and chemical sprays that left their isolation suits dripping with antiseptic foam. James appreciated the thoroughness even as he wondered what kind of contamination required this level of precaution. When the final door opened into the residential dome, they were met by a welcoming committee of 12 colonists, all armed with improvised weapons that ranged from kitchen knives to sharpened pieces of metal rebar. Dr. Park stood at the front of the group, and James barely recognized her. The woman in the colonial service photographs had been confident and vibrant, her dark hair always pulled back in a neat bun. The person before him now looked like she had aged 20 years in 3 months. Her hair had gone completely gray, and her eyes held the haunted expression of someone who had seen things that should not exist. She waved the armed colonists back and approached James with slow, careful movements. She thanked them for coming and apologized for the hostile greeting. James told her they understood completely and asked what had happened at the station. Dr. Park's face twisted with an emotion that might have been grief or perhaps shame. She said they had awakened something that had been sleeping in the soil for a very long time, something that humanity should have left buried. The residential dome had been converted into a fortress. Every window had been covered with metal sheets. The corridors leading to other parts of the station had been sealed and barricaded. 200 colonists lived in spaces designed for sleeping and recreation, all crammed together in a desperate attempt at safety. Children huddled in corners while adults took turns standing watch at the sealed entrances. The atmosphere was thick with fear and the smell of too many people living in too little space. Dr. Park led James and his crew to a makeshift command center that had been set up in what used to be the station's cafeteria. Long tables were covered with scientific equipment, handwritten notes, and samples sealed in containment jars. She offered them coffee from a machine that looked like it had been working overtime for months. James accepted gratefully and waited for her to explain. The story came out in fragments, as if Dr. Park was still trying to make sense of it herself. The Kepler station had been thriving for almost 2 years. They had successfully grown wheat, corn, potatoes, and dozens of other earth crops in the alien soil. The yields were phenomenal, better than anything produced in hydroponic stations or on Mars. The colonists were celebrating what seemed like humanity's greatest agricultural breakthrough. Then the harvest came. Workers began bringing in the crops from the largest agricultural dome, and that was when they noticed the first anomaly. Some of the wheat stalks had developed strange nodules along their stems, small bulbous growths that looked almost like tumors. Dr. Park had ordered those plants quarantined for study while the harvest continued. Within 24 hours, the nodules began to spread. Every plant in the agricultural dome developed them, and the growth started pulsing with that eerie bioluminescence. Marcus interrupted to ask if the plants were still technically plants or if they had become something else. Dr. Park smiled bitterly and said that was exactly the right question. The organisms in the domes were no longer Earth crops and they were not native Kepler vegetation either. They were something in between, a hybrid that should not be possible according to every law of biology humanity understood. Yuki leaned forward and asked how the transformation had occurred. Dr. Park pulled out a sealed sample jar containing what looked like ordinary soil at first glance. But when she held it up to the light, James could see tiny crystalline structures mixed in with the dirt. The crystals glowed faintly with the same bioluminescence as the plants outside. Dr. Park explained that these structures were not minerals in any conventional sense. They were alive, or at least they were something close to alive. They were distributed throughout the soil of Kepler 442b, lying dormant until disturbed by agricultural activity. When the colonists plowed the fields and planted their crops, they woke up something ancient. The crystalline structures had begun to replicate, spreading through the root systems of the earth plants and rewriting their genetic code at a fundamental level. The transformed plants grew at impossible speeds, doubling in size every few hours. They developed the ability to move, to sense their environment, and possibly even to think in some alien fashion. Sarah asked the question that James had been dreading. She wanted to know if the plants had hurt anyone. Dr. Park's face went pale, and she took a long moment before answering. 7 colonists had been in the agricultural domes when the transformation accelerated. 3 of them made it out, but 4 others had been caught by the rapidly growing vegetation. The plants had wrapped around them like constrictors, thin tendrils forcing their way into mouths and nostrils. The victims suffocated within minutes while their colleagues watched helplessly from behind sealed doors. But death was not the end of their horror. The bodies had been absorbed into the plant mass, broken down and consumed over the course of several days. Dr. Park had watched through observation windows as the plants dismantled human corpses with methodical efficiency, learning from the organic material they encountered. After consuming the 4 victims, the plants began developing new structures. Pods appeared among the vegetation, roughly human-sized and pulsing with internal activity. Dr. Park did not know what was growing inside those pods, and she had no desire to find out. James felt his hands start to shake, and he gripped his coffee cup tighter to hide the reaction. He asked Dr. Park why she had not evacuated the station immediately. She laughed without humor and said they had tried. The plants had spread across the landing pads and disabled their shuttles by forcing tendrils into engine intakes and fuel lines. The vegetation moved with purpose, responding to the colonists' attempts to escape by cutting off every possible route. They were trapped in a residential dome with dwindling supplies and no way to call for help, at least until Dr. Park managed to jury-rig a long-range transmitter from spare parts. Marcus stood and walked to the nearest window, even though it was covered with metal sheets. He asked if the plants were intelligent in the way humans understood intelligence. Dr. Park said that was the terrifying part. The vegetation displayed problem-solving abilities and coordinated behavior that suggested some form of collective consciousness. The plants seemed to learn from every interaction, adapting their strategies to overcome obstacles. They were patient and methodical, content to wait outside the residential dome while the colonists slowly exhausted their resources. Yuki pulled out her medical scanner and asked permission to examine some of the colonists who had been exposed to the plant growth. Dr. Park nodded and called over a young man named Thomas who had been part of the group that escaped the agricultural dome. Thomas rolled up his sleeve to reveal skin covered in a faint green tracery of lines, like veins but growing on the outside rather than beneath the surface. Yuki's scanner went crazy with readings, and her face grew grim behind her faceplate. The results showed that Thomas's body was fighting a low-level infection of the crystalline structures. They had entered through his skin during exposure to the plants, and his immune system was working overtime to contain them. So far, his body was winning the battle, but Yuki detected similar infections in every colonist she scanned. Everyone in the residential dome was carrying traces of the alien organism, held in check by human biology but always present, always waiting for a chance to spread. James made a decision in that moment. They could not evacuate 200 infected colonists back to populated areas. The risk of spreading the contamination was too great. But they also could not leave these people trapped here to die. The Steadfast had weapons and resources, limited as they were. Maybe they could find a way to destroy the plant growth or at least contain it long enough for proper help to arrive. He asked Dr. Park if she had discovered any weaknesses in the alien vegetation. She pulled out a thick notebook filled with observations and experimental data. Fire worked temporarily, but the plants adapted quickly, developing heat-resistant structures after the first few attempts to burn them. Chemical herbicides had no effect whatsoever. The vegetation seemed to thrive on toxins that would kill ordinary earth plants. Cutting the plants only caused them to regenerate faster, as if the damage stimulated growth rather than hindering it. But there was one thing that gave Dr. Park hope. The crystalline structures in the soil required specific conditions to replicate. They needed warmth, moisture, and organic material to consume. If those conditions could be disrupted, the spread might be slowed or even stopped. She had been working on a plan to overload the agricultural dome's climate control systems, freezing the plants and depriving them of the warmth they needed. It was risky and would destroy months of research, but it might give the colonists a chance to escape. James looked at his crew and saw determination reflected in their faces. They had come here to help, and they were not going to abandon these people to some alien nightmare. He told Dr. Park they would implement her plan, but they needed to move fast. The Steadfast carried enough emergency supplies to evacuate maybe 50 colonists at a time. They would need to make 4 trips back to the nearest colonial station, which meant staying at Kepler for at least 2 weeks. Dr. Park gripped his hand with surprising strength and said 2 weeks might be all they had. The plants were getting smarter, more coordinated with each passing day. She had observed them testing the residential dome's defenses, probing for weak points with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Sooner or later, they would find a way inside. When that happened, the 200 colonists would become food and raw material for whatever the alien vegetation was trying to become.